Welcome to our first session of Talk Time with Tracy. Today with me is Chief Matt Brown from the Port Orchard Police Department. Welcome, Chief Brown.
Thank you.
And we're going to just have a conversation continuing on what we began back on June 5th after the George Floyd incident. At that time, I had issued a press release and a call to action of our county police chiefs and sheriffs. And happily and welcoming was responses that I received from all of the chiefs and the involvement with the panel. So a part of that conversation was to follow up in these short sessions where we would be able to have a more intimate conversation. So I thank you for being here today with me to begin that and to be the first to follow up. So I want to kind of pick up on when we had the panel discussion. I talked a little bit about the county training that was had with Dr. Bryant Marks out of Morehouse College. And I wanted to have you talk a little bit more about that experience because I believe that was the first time we actually met.
It was. So we had been working on bringing Dr. Marks out actually before I left Poulsbo and came to Port Orchard with the goal of training every commissioned law enforcement officer in Kitsap County in that implicit bias. I've got to give all the credit to Sheriff Simpson and Chief Burchett. They were working on that project while I was working on some others, but I not only had an opportunity to go see the presentation, but have lunch with Dr. Marks. And I think what's important is that's a good jumping off point. Talking about race in this country is difficult.
Yes.
Having cops talk about race is more difficult, and having cops talk about any type of bias that they may have about race is even that much more difficult because we do pride ourselves on being fair. Now, whether or not that's the perception or not, that's the way that we feel, and I give Dr. Marks a lot of credit because he's done it enough and knows cops well enough that in his presentation he's able to kind of disarm some of that, the armor that we put on to protect ourselves, and how dare you say that I have bias against anybody? I don't. And really expose you to some concepts that say, oh, okay, maybe I do need to be more introspective. Maybe I do need to understand a little bit more, even to where, and one of the most powerful things that I got from him was he talked about the little tiny decisions that you don't necessarily know you're making, but that's your bias. But if it starts with the line level officer and then it goes up our chain of command with lots of little decisions, and then you involve someone in the criminal justice system and there's a bunch of little tiny decisions, that is how we start having that implicit bias affect people of color disparately. And we've worked on that in my department to talk about that, which is, why are we writing tickets?
Yes.
And it's different now during COVID, but what's the purpose? Are we trying to just enforce the law? Are we trying to help solve engineering issues? Or are we trying to educate the public and really look at that and say, if it's better to educate the public than putting fines on people? I mean, we're not trying to create a debtor's prison for people that aren't paying their fees, and you saw that in Ferguson.
Yes, we see that firsthand.
And I think that was the most powerful piece for the people that I work with in Port Orchard. They came out with a better understanding of being able to say, I may not feel like I have bias, but if I do, and let's say, we have that breakthrough and then people admit to it. Okay, it's this little tiny piece, but understanding the larger implications of all those little decisions.
And how something small has such a drastic impact on an individual that you may just have that one contact with based on that small bias that you have. So thank you for talking about the training. And it was over a couple of days where Dr. Marks was here and very conversational, not forcing anyone to do anything, but overall allowing for each department and each jurisdiction to be able to participate in that. So I thought that was a good precursor that then when we looked at and saw what happened, with George Floyd. And you came together as the chiefs inside of Kitsap County and made the statement and understanding and acknowledging the actions that took place was very welcoming from the standpoint of saying you didn't have to be told to make the statement. It wasn't reactive, it was proactive. And that's similar to taking the steps with the training with Dr. Marks. So continuing on, and in that conversation, in that panel, there were several things that we discussed, and one of which was also how do we deal with the public and our communities getting involved with law enforcement and having a voice and having a say-so. Port Orchard is a very large area in our county, but the city of Port Orchard is a smaller footprint inside of the county.
Yes.
In your jurisdiction. Can you speak to the difficulties that you have there and how you're addressing them?
Sure. So the city of Port Orchard is about 15,000 in population. I think it covers just shy of 12 square miles, and that doesn't include the water that we have. But what's unique for us is that because not only are we the county seat, but we're the only city in the South End.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a significantly larger population that during the day comes in, whether they're commuters or whether they're coming in for restaurants, entertainment, government services. So we actually truly serve the entire South End community. And that brings some difficulties for us, because if we say, hey, we're going to address race equity issues, or we want to look at our demographics, that's really not our demographics. I mean, we have to look at the broader South End as to how we want to serve that community and how we want to approach that larger community to say, what do you really want from us? How do you want to be served? And we're working to address that. But again, I mean, we may see that, but somebody who lives in Burley may not see why they have any piece of Port Orchard. But that takes outreach and engagement and communication.
So since we had the panel discussion, have you implemented any citizens review boards or panel review boards? Yeah,
so we started a strategic advisory board. So when I got here in July of 2019, this was actually a piece of what we were going to do and got a little derailed early February with COVID, but we have set up a 9-person strategic advisory board with the goal of helping us to create our 3 to 5 year plan. We just started meeting once we were able to kind of figure out how to get that done. We've got representatives from faith-based groups, service-based groups, justice groups, community members at large, the business community, Chamber of Commerce. And the idea behind that is to bring that group together and say, look, we know how to commit acts of law enforcement, but what do you want us to look like? What do you want us to try and do? Because if we only decide that ourselves, I mean, we're talking in a house full of mirrors. I need to, if I truly believe that I serve the community, I have to go ask them, like, what do you want? You know, and we've had 2 meetings so far. The first meeting is mostly just the introductions. We brought in Steve Strand, who's the current executive director of the Washington Associations of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs. He's from Kitsap. He was actually the Bremerton chief for a number of years as our facilitator. So the first day was really me introducing myself, since I'm a relatively new chief to the area, and Steve talking about some of these other issues. And then we left that first meeting with what he calls question 0.
Okay.
And question 0 is, why do we have a police department? And specifically, why do we have the Port Orchard Police Department? And that was the conversation that led into our second meeting.
Okay.
And I'm really proud of that group. You know, especially with everything going on, there is a racial component to why do police departments exist, and you know, there's a history of policing and race that we have to acknowledge and we have to talk about, or we're not going to improve it. And we started talking about that, and that's a hard conversation, and I'm really proud of that group of men and women, because they engaged in that conversation, and we got some positive movement on that. So with that, there's a couple. I'm hoping to come out with 4 or 5 goals.
Okay.
They've made 2 recommendations already. One is community engagement, and the other is communication, and we need to flush that out a little bit more. I think engagement gets tossed around a lot, and you and I've talked about.
Yes.
I don't like the word outreach
Mhm.
because it implies that it's something extra that I should be doing as
Mhm.
opposed to a basic of my job.
And engagement is a little bit more encompassing and
Yes.
more of a we all play a part in it.
Correct.
Okay.
And you know, it's about building relationships, and
Mhm.
you shouldn't wait until there's a crisis to have relationships.
Mhm.
And that's something I learned very, very early on from my first chief, who formed community groups like that, and it made a lot of sense after we had something that happened. You know, to my 25-year-old graveyard cop brain, I'm like, oh, now I get it. And those
Mhm.
relationships are important, and you shouldn't have a police department, period, if you can't build those relationships and maintain them. So those are the 2 recommendations that they have. We're going to talk a little bit more about race equity and what does that mean.
Okay.
What I've found great also about that group is we talked about what's going on in the nation and that national conversation.
Mhm.
But the reality is that I can only affect a very, very small piece of our community, not even our whole community. And they've been very, very good and gracious about saying we want to set these goals, but they're goals that are obtainable for the Port Orchard Police Department and for Chief Brown and for our staff there.
Mhm.
I can't fix Minneapolis. I can't fix poverty. I can't fix education, but I can work to build those relationships so that there's a strong bond between the community and the police department.
And you can be an example for other police forces by
That's
starting.
certainly our goal.
Okay. And establishing your advisory panel, you mentioned some of the diversity that exists. And we talked a little bit about the footprint that you have, the 15,000 versus a little bit over 70,000
Yes.
in the entire Port Orchard South Kitsap area.
Yes.
How are you, how does your advisory members represent those outside of that 15,000 footprint?
So what we did, we, you know, and again, being kind of newer to the area, I had to rely on you. I had to rely on some of the other chiefs in the area. So to be honest, I just started wearing my shoes out and going and talking to people. And so the decision was made to not only base that panel on people who lived within the city of Port Orchard.
Okay, good.
Because it doesn't make sense. If we serve that greater South End community, we have to involve them. So the criteria that we laid out was we want to make sure that we're as close to our demographic as we can get, but we have people who have solid ties to the Port Orchard community. So we have business leaders that don't necessarily live in town, but own businesses or have a company that does a lot of business within the city, so that they really have a feel for daily interactions within that community. Yes.
And then, so you said at-large positions, and those at-large positions include people that don't necessarily live within the city, but live in the South Kitsap area.
We have 2 at-large positions. I believe they do both live within the city limits. One of the recommendations that I'm going to ask, and again, this is an advisory board, so I can still do other things. We want to have a community advisory board that comes out of this process.
Okay.
So that we don't just say I just want this so I can create my plan, and thanks, we'll talk to you in 5 years when we want to do this again. I would like to have a group that is a core that we can meet quarterly or however often they would like to meet, so we can discuss these issues. So when we have significant policy changes coming up, we can talk to them about that. And my hope is that this board is going to be able to say, hey, you know who should be on this? You should have this person. And we've already identified a couple additional people that we'd like to have on that panel. And I think that the larger that we have that, while still keeping it manageable, you get not only a greater segment of the population, but not everybody's going to go to every meeting.
Yes, correct.
So
Yes.
the other thing that we're hoping to have come out of this, and as part of that communication piece, are some regular town halls.
Okay.
When I worked for the sheriff's office on the east side,
Mhm.
I think we did, and granted, it was a significantly larger area.
Mhm.
I think we did 19 town halls a year.
Okay.
And eventually got to the point nobody came because they got what they needed out of them. But
Mhm.
I think it's important to be, at least me professionally, I think it's important to have our department be that approachable,
Okay.
where on a regular basis the community can come to a facilitated conversation and ask me or ask the other officers that are there hard questions and get reasonable answers out of it.
Okay.
Otherwise, you either go to city council meetings, you call me direct, or you have to have a relationship where we have coffee. And I think we should have a bigger venue for that.
So one of the things in my call to action was addressing the topic of citizens review boards with subpoena, with some teeth, is what a lot of us in NAACP and around the county have seen. And our Kitsap County is very different than King County, and it's very different than Spokane. It's very different than Pierce.
Correct.
And we know it's very different than the Midwest.
Correct.
But in the same sense, we're not without issues. We're not without significant concerns as to what's happening around our county. So there is a sense of having an advisory panel. Doesn't that just mean they're just having conversations? Or does that mean that they can make recommendations and there can be some actions taken from it? And from there, if we can delve into your plan, which is your 3 to 5 year plan that you're working on, and how that will build into that plan.
I think that community review panels, I think there are times and places and departments where that's appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge to the community as a whole is come take a look at us first.
Okay.
I look at those review boards, and what that tells me is there's no trust at all.
Mm-hmm.
We work very, very hard in this county with KCERT, with following I-940 and Latixa and doing the right thing.
Okay.
But I also understand that, again, the national conversation drives feelings, and feelings are important. And what I would challenge groups or concerned citizens is come talk to me. I know it's a little hard right now. You can't come sit in my office and have a cup of coffee, but I challenge you to come take a look at our process. And I think that when you take a look at it and what we're doing and what we have done in the last 18 months, I think that trust is there. I can tell you, I know we're doing the right thing. We are the last agency in the county that's seeking accreditation, and we will get there.
Okay.
We're about halfway done right now, but that's a piece of showing why you should trust us. And I think if you can come down and take a look at what we do, anybody that looks at what we do, looks at our process is going to say that's fair and you're doing the right thing and holding your people accountable. And that's not a top-down. I mean, if you have a top-down way of doing business for accountability, I believe you're doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. You have to have officers that are willing to hold their peers accountable.
Yes.
I mean, it was already in place for us, and if you see somebody using more force, yeah, you have to report that. You don't want to work with people like that, and it's irresponsible to have people that do that stay in the department. When you make mistakes, you need to own them, and your peers need to make sure that you're owning them. And not only that, but it's important that you document it. And the documentation piece leads to that transparency, which leads to trust. Because if you come to me and say, hey, I heard about X, Y, and Z, and I can say, oh, yeah, you bet, Tracy, we handled that. What you should say is, okay, prove it. And we have a pretty robust way to prove that. So that would be my first challenge to the community is before you start trying to build this larger process, let's figure out if we do need it, as opposed to I feel that the country needs it. Okay, well, those of us that are doing right, come see first.
So it's not something that you would completely say is not necessary. You're at a place where you're starting from trust. And if there was a need to do something beyond that, you would take the necessary steps to address it.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is I work for the community. I mean, if they want me to wear pink, I'll wear pink. I would prefer not to. It
Breast
doesn't
Cancer
bring out
Month.
my eyes, but
For Breast Cancer Month, we could wear pink.
yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes. We are doing No Shave November for us too, but yeah, we'll get to the pink.
Yes. So after the panel discussion, I have a group that I work with. We Vital Communications Group. That's kind of a subcommittee of the NAACP's general body meetings, and I've invited you there, and we've had conversations. We've looked throughout the county and on the county's websites to see what types of reports each police department has available for the public, and found that there's some difficulty in accessing information. So again, as you said, one of the things is communication that you're going to be working on going forward, and how to document things of excessive force and things that are reported. What do you have in the works for that?
So I do appreciate the invites. Tuesday nights are my council nights, so I need to be there. But if you have something major, I will certainly request to skip. So part of the reason, and I can't explain what happened before I took the chief's position. We are going to be doing at least annual reporting, and there'll be two reports that come out of that concept. The first is the annual report. Here's our crime rate. Here's how we responsibly spent our budget. Here's some feel-good stories about what we've done. Here's a bunch of other things. The other is going to be a professional standards report, and this is exactly what you're talking about, which is I want to know about the complaints and how those complaints were resolved. I can tell you that since July of last year, if you call and make a complaint, we will take that complaint and investigate. If you call up and says the chief visits me every night in an alien spaceship, we will investigate whether or not. And as a matter of fact, if you complain about me, there will be an outside investigator that does it. So we take every complaint, we document every complaint, and every person who does complain gets a letter from me or my deputy chief that says, this is what we did, this is what we found, and here's our results. Every use of force is documented. We have also changed that, so we're reporting more uses of force. Prior to getting there, we did not document when we pointed weapons at people. Well, that's a seizure under the Fourth Amendment that should be documented. And it's not that we weren't documenting it in a case report, but that's not data we can track. So we now track that, and there's got to be a report from the officer that uses that level of force for that seizure. The sergeant now does what's called an internal review on every single one of those, and that's not in that moment of time, was that justified? That's hey, was our cop there legal? I mean, was he allowed to even be there? Was the force that she used, was it an acceptable and reasonable amount of force? And were there other options that could have been used? And that's that extended part of the conversation, which is when we use force, we should be able to talk about it afterwards and say, was there a possibility for you not to have used? Well, it may have been reasonable, but would there have been a better way? And one of the things that I also want to start doing is tracking our de-escalation. So, I mean, I think we can both acknowledge de-escalation requires both sides to have a positive vote. But we don't track our successes. We're not very good at that. We track, hey, if we need to improve it, we should track our successes, because I think the community needs to know that as well. Are you doing the things that we've asked you to do and saving lives through de-escalation? And we can say here. So you'll start seeing those things probably February, March. I mean, that's by the time we can get that data together and get the reports put together. I mean, if the community is looking to have monthlies, we can work to get that on the website. We're continuing to build that out with a lot of information. Trying to do it on a monthly basis. You may miss some stuff just because things haven't been adjudicated. And but again, we work for the community, and if that's what they want, we'll figure it out.
So currently it's set to be on an annual basis, where you have an annual report. And that report will be available on the website.
Be on the website
for the public to be able to see.
Yeah, and we'll probably put some hard copies out for people that may or may not have the interwebs, and
Vital communication for our
yeah,
vulnerable populations that don't have access to Wi-Fi.
correct. So, to include in that too, I mean, it's not just complaints and uses of force, but any other critical instance, pursuits, collisions. I mean, you guys need to know: are you spending a lot of money because we're backing into things,
Yeah.
and whether or not we are policing biased. I think there's a larger conversation, and again, this is something that we're going to talk about on our strategic advisory board: is what data do you collect to say is your policing biased? And Dr. Goff, and I forget the university he's from, but that's one of the things he talks about too, is, well, how are you collecting your data? Okay. So we looked at that after I watched that presentation. I think it was to the House. We collect data on people we write tickets to, but we don't collect data on people we don't write tickets to. All right. So maybe we should, but does that now mean that my expectation of the officers is every time you contact somebody, hey, what race are you? What do you identify as? And I think that can also create an additional barrier. And so those are larger conversations about what the community wants and what it means for us to collect that information.
Just as we come to a close and wrap up our conversation for today, and again, thank you for being here with me. In closing, what would you like for the community to know about what's happening in the Port Orchard Police Department, and intentions on continuing to be involved with the NAACP in our annual community dinner that we have in every December? We're looking forward to that coming up. But what would you like for the community to know as far as things that you see on the horizon?
So again, I mean, I like to say that exactly what you talked about before is we want to be a department that's an example. We work very hard creating a new mission, vision, and values statement when I first got here, and one of the things in our vision is being amongst the best. I'm not going to be the best because that means I don't have to work anymore, but that means that we have to be, if there are problems, people should say, hey, if we want to fix that, go talk to Port Orchard, they already solved it. So the big ask that I have for the community is they need to be engaged too. I need, if the expectation is that we reach out and we are involved more and we're truly a community-based police department, I need the community to also take that uncomfortable step and reach out and talk to us as well, and know that when you have hard, uncomfortable conversations, the purpose of that is for everybody to get better. And the last component of that is that you have to recognize, especially when you talk about crime and public safety, is that it's a lot about feeling. And while something may not actually be happening, if people feel that it is, then it's still a problem. And that's even part of our mission statement, is that we're going to work to solve crime and reduce the fear of crime. The example that I use is we have business owners down on the waterfront that are very, very concerned about crime down on the waterfront. But when I go look at the data, it doesn't bear out that there's a crime problem on the waterfront, but they feel that way. And if they feel that way, the public's going to feel that way, and then they don't go to the waterfront, and we have a problem that I can't solve because it's not something that I can touch. And that's why I need the community again to when we have these town halls, or we come out and say, hey, we want you to be on our board, we want you to come be engaged with us and to come sit down with us and talk.
So changing the perspective of
Yes.
how things are looked at and the relationships among our police and our community.
Yes.
Again, thank you. And I'm Tracy Flood, president of the NAACP. NAACPBremerton.org is our website. Thank you for taking the time to be here with me today for Talk Time with Tracy.